Last but not least, Dr. Asa Hilliard, and he's going to present to us as practitioners. Now that we have this whole foundation laid, he's going to tell us how we should do it. The actual practices in the classroom, SEBA, teaching wisdom and study, and African pedagogy. Dr. Asa Hilliard.
Fred, thank you very much. Acknowledging our Creator, who's hidden but still the source of all life, power, and health, and calling upon the spirits of our ancestors to bless our endeavors and to continue to guide us as we attempt to solve the problems of our families and communities. I want to express my personal appreciation to Sankofa Shue, and especially to its director and all the people associated with her husband and family, for the leadership that they have taken and become responsible for in bringing us together and helping us to amplify the kinds of things that we're trying to do. Sometimes people say, you folk read and write and talk, but you don't do anything. And so to have living examples of those things that we consider to be critical and important is really extraordinary. But it's not just an example at a pragmatic level, it's also theory in practice. So these are theoreticians and practitioners. I'm also very appreciative and want to acknowledge the outstanding contributions of the panelists who have preceded me, not only here, but in their lives. So much of what we have and enjoy today is due to their efforts. Dr. Karinga did a brilliant, actually Dr. Asante first, did a brilliant job of helping us to understand centeredness against that's what we would have had before, but against this business of oppression and domination that has is its major function to dehumanize Africans. That's right. And so the antidote to dehumanization is recentering, to bring ourselves back into focus and to articulate all the elements of that, as he did and does in his life work, is really a critical step to pose that as the problem. And then Dr. Karinga did a brilliant job of moving to the core of African culture, because we're not merely people who are oppressed. There are many people stop right there and figure that the problem is not to be oppressed. No, the problem is to reaffirm our humanity. And the way we do that is to look closely at ourselves. And one of the ways that we can look closely at ourselves is to look at the best of who we are and what we are by rigorous interrogation of our traditions and of our orientation. And his exposition on Ma'at and other aspects of African consciousness and values that predate our oppression, that are independent of our oppression, is absolutely essential to giving robustness to the who we are. So we are much more than our response to oppression. We pre-existed the oppression. And then Dr. McAdoo helps us to understand this nurturing role of the family. Once we understand the direction through centeredness, and once we understand the fact that there is something to be centered about, then this family has this protective and nurturing role. And she articulated some dimensions of the whole identity crisis that were very informative. It was said that Hillary didn't get it all right, and she didn't. Many people don't get it right because that slogan has been lifted from African people. It takes a whole village to raise a child. It's almost a benevolent statement about children. You know, here's this poor little child, and everybody in the village has got to help raise this whole child. But if you know African tradition, probably a better way of saying it is it takes a whole village to raise itself, because the child is bonded to the people in the village and they have a stake in this child's life. That's not benevolence, that's survival for everybody. And so part of what we have to do is to define, in the way that we're attempting to do it today, those things that are really important for us as far as our independent responsibilities to ourselves, to define who we have been, who we are, and who we will become. Before I say the rest of what I want to say, I want to go back because Dr. Asante quoted Dr. Karenga in what I think is one of the truly profound statements that he has made to characterize our situation today. He says, "I have argued since the 60s and still contend that the key crisis in black life is the cultural crisis, not the racial crisis, not the class crisis, not the economic crisis. The key crisis in black life is the cultural crisis. That is, the view and value crisis. It is a crisis which reflects itself in a deficient view of self, society, and the world, and in values or categories of commitment and priorities which diminish our human possibilities. Liberation as a human possibility must express itself as both an intellectual and social situation and practice. But cultural or intellectual liberation precedes and makes possible social liberation. In a word, until we break the monopoly that the oppressor has on our minds, liberation is not only impossible, it is unthinkable." African pedagogy. Could I have the first slide? Just to show that the dehumanization has, oh, it's up there already, has not stopped. These are three of the film, and I found out that there was a fourth that I didn't have an opportunity to put on. In the last year, the three most popular film on African people, all of them had exactly the same theme. Innocent black men in prison. You had, and two of them were Academy Award nominees, The Hurricane and The Green Mile. The other one was Life, which was a comedy, and had Eddie Murphy and Martin Lawrence in it. But in every case, they were innocent black men in prison. Okay. Now that's how the world views us. And it not only views us in that way, but it takes steps that result in the fact that virtually, you'd say the working population of the black family is in prison. 1 million of the prisoners are African. Out of a population, if you just take the men, of about 20 million African men, and if you take the African males, and if you take the men part of the males, the ones that are in working years, and then you take 1 million as a part of that, then you can see the devastation that is wreaked in practice on African families and also on the images of African people. And these are, I guess, supposed to be the role models for our children. And so if people who have options to serve us do what comes to mind, and then it's reflected in what happens in Hollywood, do you think that people who work in other occupations are going to have images that are any different for them? When they look at our children, if they're teachers, when they look at our people, if they're physicians or psychologists, what is the image in the mind that they have of us? But worse, what is the image that we have in our minds of us? And then it is based on those images that we choose to do certain things. So before I get into the substance of what I want to say, I would like to simply share something in a very brief way that I'd really like to do over a long period of time. But I'd like to share something on the overheads from the 18th dynasty, which is the first time that are different than these images. But from the first time that we have the physical remains of our ancestors. And I have several reasons for wanting to show these things. And because we had a long discussion last night about the role of women at the point of our incarceration and degradation as those who will perform the ISIS function, that is to identify those pieces of this broken body of African people and bring those pieces back together again and serve the ISIS function of revivifying the dead body of Osiris and making it live again and restoring the creative principle and so forth. So I'd like to simply dedicate this to those sisters who have performed and will perform and do perform, and certainly in the past performed that function, by looking at some of the royal women of the 18th dynasty. Their actual bodies, not their paintings, not their carving, but their actual mummified bodies. So I'd like to start off first with the, you skipped the first one, that's, no, turn it over. Turn those whole pack over, yeah. And you can skip that first one and just put the first mummy up. The first image is actually from the 17th dynasty. And I'm putting this up in part because most of us have never seen these women. Not because there aren't images of them, but they're never shown. People prefer to show foreign women when they talk about Africa, especially its ancient classical culture. They prefer to show Nefertiti, who is a foreign woman from Mesopotamia. They prefer to show Cleopatra, who comes out of the Ptolemaic line. But they prefer not to show the bodies of the Africans themselves in order to claim white Egypt. This is Teta Sherry with short nappy-haired cornrows from the 17th dynasty, whose son was the liberation pharaoh Sekhmenri. We also have his mummy, who is also black. And her daughter is next, her granddaughter is next, the daughter of Sekhmenri. I'm not showing the men, so I'm skipping those. But her daughter is Nefertari, who is also short, actually cornrows and extensions on the mummy on the body of the mummy. And Nefertari was the queen mother of the 18th dynasty and was worshipped as a goddess in a way that Nefertiti never was. She was always a foreigner to the Africans. And she was not the most beautiful woman in the world, as the Egyptologists are so fond of saying. And next. And notice I'm not talking about any of the captives. I'm only talking about the queens. Queen Amhos and Hapi, with the cornrows and extensions, almost dreaded up. In the 18th dynasty. This is part of the royal family of the 18th dynasty. And next, and by the way, I think these images ought to be made available to our children, because a lot of people say, y'all making this up, this connection to ancient Kemet. This is Lady Ray, also with cornrows and extensions. Next. This sister was found in the tomb of Amenhotep II, and we don't know who she was, but we know she was royal. And I put her up there mainly because she has the what looks like the hot comb treatment and trouble in the kitchen. Okay, if you put is there a map in there? Okay, show the map, and then I'll be done with that, and we'll get into it. Beg pardon? Yeah, you can put Queen T up there too. That's not a mummy. We actually have Queen T's mummy. I just didn't have to bring her. But she's the one, next to Nefertari, in my opinion. I think this is the greatest of all. In fact, she actually was ruling in place of her husband even while he was sitting on the throne, because people just bypassed him altogether. The kings bypassed him and went to her in order to get things that they wanted in the kingdom. Queen T, that's the mother of Akhenaten, and we think Tutankhamun. But what we're talking about, everything inside that white square is what these women ruled over. That's all of Saudi Arabia, just about, all the way up to Khartoum, coming into upper Africa, all of the Tigris and Euphrates rivers, parts of Greece, and most of the Aegean Sea. So that part was what Africa controlled at the time of the 18th dynasty. There's a book called When Egypt Ruled the East that has this map in it, and also talks about not only the kings, but the queens, but the kings as well. So when Maulana talks about ma'at as a principle, as a core value, not only of Kemet, but of Africa as a whole, then we're talking about people who by this time had evolved thousands of years to get to these concepts that we now understand as ma'at. That was in place then, 1,500 years before the birth of Christ, but even long before that, thousands of years before that, the same value system. The thing that made us human, the thing that made us manifest, and this is what had to be crushed. So it was not merely the physical containment of African, it was the cultural containment of African that caused us to be in the destroyed position that we're in. African pedagogy. African pedagogy. And I'm going to have to work out the other word, the seba'it, and other words, African words for pedagogy being a Greek word, derives from, where does it come from? In other words, what you do, once you decide where you have to go, once you know the nature and characteristics of the thing that you're seeking, then what is it that the people who are called teachers and those who are called socializers, how is it that they organize to do what it is that they have to do? Where does what we call pedagogy derive from? First, African pedagogy must derive from an African worldview. That's the first thing. You cannot have an African-centered school for people who, if the people who run it have no African worldview. The African worldview is a view about how the world works. Where did it come from? What is humanity? What does that mean? You answer all those questions about nature. You answer the questions about mankind. You answer the questions about culture, and that becomes the frame of the African worldview. So those who teach and socialize our children must have an African worldview if they are centered. It also derives from our African context. So that a part of what we have to do in an African pedagogy is respond not only to our worldview, but to our context as it is now, given racism, given oppression, and so forth. Sometimes we get stuck on one side or the other of that coin. We stick on the worldview and forget the fact that we're oppressed, or we stick on oppression and forget the fact that we have a worldview. You'd never be whole unless you deal with both of those things. So how do we know if we decide that we have to respond to the worldview that is uniquely ours and the context that is uniquely ours? How do we find out, without having to invent something, what it is that we should do as teachers and socializers? And I deliberately use the word teaching and socialization because I think, like Shue was mentioned earlier, too much schooling, too little education. That we have language that fits the limited expectations of schools in America. Not just for Africans, but for everybody. This business of getting somebody ready to get a job, and the only reason for getting a job is making money. That's the only value. Let's be clear about that. The only value that dominates America today is accumulation. That's the only value. There are no other values. And that's why you can, for example, you try to express a different value in terms of screening what goes on TV. The only thing that's going to go on TV is anything that makes money. There's no way to say no if someone wants to sponsor something on TV. You can see anything on TV that anybody can imagine. Nothing is inappropriate. That's an example of what I'm talking about. So that we have to look at the sources of knowledge about what it takes to respond to our context and our worldview. For example, you've already heard reference to text, and I understand that Mylana's getting ready to come out with some more of them to fill out the who see it. But there are texts on pedagogy, and Brother Malefi has one here, the Egyptian Philosophers. This is the thing that people didn't want us to have. And by the way, this is the most frightening thing to our oppressors, is the fact that we have a culture that's both independent, older, and in some cases deeper and better than the culture that we've been fed. And the fact that we have the capability to uncover these things and talk about those, they'd much rather have us call them names.
Now. That's right.
Yeah.
That's right.
And to complain about the oppression and so forth. But we have something far better than that. And so the texts themselves, once they are revealed, must be in the possession. This is because they tell us what pedagogy is. Tahotep is a teacher. Mary Kara is a teacher. These are Amenhotep is a teacher. We have to understand that. Or Menamop is a teacher. We have biographies, not just Kemet. We have biographies. See, this ought to be in the preparation of teachers. To be pedagogues, you ought to have the biographies that reveal how Africans organize schools. Jomo Kenyatta's Facing Mount Kenya talks about how he went, what happened to him when he went to school. So you get a view from that of what the teachers were like. Biography, and we have biography. Sometimes novels. 2000 Seasons by Armand talks about a socialization process as viewed by Africans. Chinua Achebe, Things Falls Apart, No Longer at Ease, Man of the People, Heir of God, a whole set of novels, and listen at the language of Africans as they talk. They talk in proverbs, which is one of the ways to teach and socialize. In fact, mastery of proverbs is one of the prime teaching tools for Africans who say, and when people say we can't think abstractly. In fact, we almost only think abstractly as Africans.
That's right.
Anthropologists have done studies. There's a book by Bassi Anda, a Nigerian anthropologist. It has a whole chapter on indigenous African pedagogy. So you can see how the teachers organize for instruction. Griot and Debtor, sometimes it's European, blew their minds with the Dogon in Mali. The Pale Fox, Conversations with Ogotimele, and the essence of those two reports of these two French anthropologists spending 15 years studying in the system of the Dogon, and they only got to the first level out of 4 major levels. will reveal and reflect how Africans think about the education process. Fukiao, Kindizi, the Congo art of babysitting. Self-healing, lessons, old lessons from Africa. Revealed in a very short little book. One I think is only 80 pages, maybe less than that. Kindizi, very profound description in detail of the specifics of teaching and learning and how you organize to not just educate, not just school, but to fully socialize. Socialization has education and schooling inside it. And to get the African view on this, it's so stark as a contrast to what we get when we go through a normal teacher training process. Pierre Ernie, Childhood and Cosmos, and also the second book by Ernie, which title I can't remember at the moment, goes into detail from the studies of anthropologists who look at Africans. What other source? Interviews. This is one of the things that I try to tell students all the time, that we're about to lose libraries because the old people who knew about the independent, organized education systems of Africa are dying. Their schools are closing because they no longer have control of their students. And we have the opportunity for those few who remain, like Fukiao and others, to interrogate them about the nature of the socialization process, and we haven't done that. And when we do, these things are so profound. In the case of Fukiao, for example, from the Congo, describing his system of governance in a book called Mbange, it caught the fancy of a higher education institution, a university in Florida. And the faculty got so excited by it that they organized their whole college. They restructured it around, as best they could, with the help of Fukiao, around his concept of governance in a college and university. And I understand that the success of that effort was apparent to everybody. This is profound stuff. This is not poot butt stuff like we normally get. Observations of actual practices in those things that are not secret and are revealed. And finally, participation in initiation. There are those Africans who open the initiation process to those of us in other parts of the world. In fact, they've even opened them up to some Europeans. And that to take advantage of going through those processes in order to get a view of how you structure the process. So I'm just saying something. That's the source of knowledge about content and about those things that we're supposed to have. Now, when people talk about pedagogy, normally we talk about purpose, that is aims of the education process. Teachers must have that in view. What are you trying to accomplish? Most of the time when you say, tell me how to teach, people are talking about techniques. You know, what did I do Monday? They're talking about techniques. But if you don't understand where you're headed, no technique will work. Right. Or maybe any technique will get you wherever you're not going. Method. Usually you have to say something about method. That is teaching and learning. What is it that you have to do in order to get to your aim? And then content. Then the content. What is the content that you use to illustrate the principles that you're aiming for? And then finally, what is the outcome that you seek? How do you know that you've been successful when you socialize and educate someone? Very briefly then, it looks something like this. Let's look briefly at worldview. What do we mean by worldview? For the African, as you've already heard, it's a living world. If you see the Zulu Declaration, for example, you heard the kids say it, and I think it's in your program. That's a very different worldview than our kids are normally exposed to, and certainly not a Western worldview. But it is an African worldview, and there's no reason for us to give that worldview up. There's every reason for us to embrace that worldview. It's a living world. It's a divine world. Therefore, the children that we teach are living and divine. It's a communal world, as well as the physical world, and we are not aliens in this world.
That's right.
See? Marimba Ane's book, Urugu, and Jake Carruthers' book, Medu Neter, and other work by both of those talk about the essential feature of the evolution of European culture against which you can contrast African culture is that in European culture they evolved to the point where they are alien from the world, as well as alien from things in the world, as well as alien from people in the world. That alienation is a part of the experience of European thought and behavior. And that's okay if they want to be there. Most don't once they see what the alternative is. But for Africans, we're integral. We're part of the world. Look at the Zulu Declaration in terms of worldview. And the world of which we are part is a world which can best be described as fitting ma'at. That's what Baba Karenga was trying to say to us a little earlier. And we need time on that. We can't take time here, but we need a lot of time. In fact, I think he's got a 2-volume thesis on ma'at and didn't finish. It takes a lot of time to invest if we want to understand our own worldview. It's not only in Kemet that this concept of ma'at. Obenga has shown that that same term appears in African languages throughout the continent. And even when the term doesn't appear, the concept of balance and harmony and reciprocity, those concepts appear as central core principles of African worldview. So that we have a reciprocal, in the African worldview, we have a reciprocal relationship to a Ma'atian world. That has profound significance for method and technique. If you have that view as a teacher, and that's what you must have. In other words, teacher training must bring a teacher who teaches an African child to that understanding, so that that's a reality. That's not just some thing that you say. It's not just a lot of words that you repeat, but your life itself must be oriented toward that worldview. Context. The context that we have, that we must respond to first, is the physical environment, to the social environment that we find ourselves in, to the cultural environment that we find ourselves in, especially if it's not ours, to the spiritual environment. We must be sensitive to all of that. And to this, the geopolitical environment. This is where we fall down. We tend not to be up on what geopolitics is all about, especially how the geopolitics of the world relates to us. This is serious. Little children are supposed to begin to understand those things, but they can't if the teachers don't. The geopolitics relating to Africans means that we have to understand slavery. Not only that it was, but what it was. That we have to understand colonization. Not only that it was, but what it was. That we have to understand segregation or apartheid. Not only what it was, but that it was, but what it was. And that we have to, above all, understand the ideology of white supremacy. Not only that it was, but what it was. We must understand all of that. That's part of our context. That's not what I would prefer to talk about. I don't want to spend any time, I don't want to have to spend any time on that. I'd much rather spend more time looking at the culture, this enriched culture that we brought with us that informed the world. I'd really rather spend my time on that, but I can't get to that because of this. So that's, both of those are part of the context. That's the problem and a problematic for African people. And of course we have to learn how to counter this ideology and this hegemony. That's part of this, the context. And so therefore, for the purpose, given this worldview and context, our aim as African people ought to be what it has always been. And you heard in the presentations that preceded what the aims were. These are high-level aims. To do ma'at, that's the aim, if you can sum it up. And of course that means a lot of things, to do ma'at. And in the Kemetic term, to build for eternity. This is a little different than getting a job. To build for eternity is an entirely different aim. To understand, to have excellent behavior, to have an orientation, and to follow the principles of Nguzo Saba. These are African values, and these are the aims of the education process for African people. You say, well, Asa, does that mean that we don't do like calculus and multiplication and addition, subtraction, and division? No, that's understanding. That's skill. But we don't pump up skills as the ultimate goal. By the way, we're good at this. I mean, we're very good at this. The Garvey School was going to be here, and this school, and lots of other schools around the country. One of the things that's being shown, especially in African-centered schools, that the skill level is extraordinary. They're blowing people away. Chick Elementary School in Kansas City was performing at such a high level, they wouldn't even report the scores. Because to report the scores meant that you'd have to give legitimacy to the African approach. And they didn't want to do it. So no, we're not short on that, but we can't stop there, because you will train educated fools, as my mother used to say. You will train people who can actually be turned against themselves because they don't have the worldview. They got the skills with no worldview. And then the method. You know, what's distinct in terms of Africa? We distinguish ourselves in terms of our purpose. We distinguish ourselves in terms of our method. We distinguish ourselves in terms of our content and in terms of our outcome. We are distinct in terms of all of those things. So let's look at how we're distinct in terms of the method. The first thing is that we have to understand the best of what we have as far as teachers. In Kemetic, the name for the best is Seba, the teacher. In Ethiopia, the name for the best is Jegna. In West Africa, the name for the best is Jele or Jele Muso. Jele, which the French call griot. Jele Muso, which the French call griot. Men and women who stand as the pinnacles of excellence in the culture. The Jegna in Ethiopia is at the pinnacle of excellence. That's the model that the teachers, most teachers don't have that model. You can have national certification. And if you understand anything about a Seba, Jegna, Jele Muso, you'll find that they don't even begin to approach what's required to meet the standards of African teaching. We brought those standards here with us. And of course, those were the things as we were dehumanized that we were supposed to forget. And so these Jele and Jelemusos and Sebas and Jegnas and other names in other African communities are characterized by acts of commitment. See, it's one thing to pass the NTE. It's another thing to have a commitment. National Teachers Exam, that's what NTE is for those who haven't had to hit it. The teacher has an act of identity. That's different than having clients. The person who's treating a patient may not be identified with the patient at all, but a teacher has to have that. The African teacher does. The teacher performs an act of relationship, not just an identity, but a bond must be established between the teachers and the pupil. That's an African term. That's not necessarily so in professional terms. Character, an act of character. Teaching is an act of character. Purpose. Teaching is an act of purpose. Spirit. Teaching is an act of spirit. Teaching is an act of passion. I'm talking about African teachers now. The rest of the world may not have these things, but Africans do. This is universal on the African. Every time I go anywhere where I understand anything, when I get introduced to our great teachers, the model, these are the things that they all have. Discipline. Teaching is the act of discipline. In Pedagogy it says, a man teaches as he acts. A little earlier, that's what Baba Asante said. The man teaches that when you behave, and I think it was Maulana said, as you move around, that when you say, I am teacher, it's not just when you're standing in front of a classroom. Everything in your life teaches whether you want it to or not. Now, there are some people who know how to organize school based on that, that concept. Look at Fukuyao's work in Kindizi, the Congo Art of Babysitting. Even the location of the school. Where is it? In Congo, it's everywhere. They don't even have a building. They call it the Sadulu. The Sadulu is what they call a moving school. And as adults take children with them, they teach them about everything around them. This is very different. Very different than anything. Oh yes, we have field trips. Sometimes. If you're good. Teaching for the African is rooted in culture. You cannot teach African children if you're not rooted in the culture. Teaching strives toward mastery. We have the word, I'm in teacher education, we have the word called master teacher. 95% of the teachers who are called master teachers are not master teachers. They're available teachers. That's the place where you send someone for an internship. They're available. They're not master. Master is a statement about level of expertise and performance. And in Africa, it's a statement of all these other things about commitment and values and character and so forth. And so African teachers rooted in culture who become masters then become teachers who can cause students to do certain things that are natural for humans and in fact for primates. If you look at how primates are trained. The schooling process for primates are imitation. See, these things, you can get in all kinds of discussion in educational theory classes about what I'm saying right now. Imitation. That's not supposed to be a good technique. That's the main technique for human beings. Human beings like to watch. Show me. If you're showing somebody how to dance, how to play basketball, show me with a perfect model. And gradually as I imitate, I become more and more like my model. Repetition. They say, oh, that's rote. Rote got a bad name.
Yes.
In fact, they say, don't do it. That's low-level thinking, except in medical school. They got so much stuff you got to learn in medical school. You better learn it by rote. Why do you need to learn it by rote? Because after you learn it by rote, then you're free to think about it when it's automatic.
All right.
So you can reflect on it. There's nothing wrong with imitation. If all you do is imitate, if all you do is repeat, then of course you're stuck at a level that's different from where African people are. Robust immersion. I'm talking about what Africans do as technique now, as method. Robust immersion. Immerse the children. If you look at Fukuyao in the Congo, they put the children where the adults are even. If the adults are having fusses and fights, trying to resolve problems in the Mbangi, the children are there. You don't know what they're learning. The child may not even be speaking yet. But they pick up your vibes, and as they get older, they hear the language, and then they can put a real face on the things that you're trying to do in school. So a robust immersion in what is real. Not Donald Duck and Mickey Mouse. Not Dick, Jane, Spot, and Puff. What is real? That's what African people do. The children learn through play. They learn, look, what does play do? Play gives you the combination, the free combination of a whole lot of things at the same time. You could call it play as the children were dancing here. But while they're dancing, they're learning. They're internalizing the value system, the language. using music, art, drama, literature, and games. And then, of course, using the collective. One of the worst things you can do for Africans is stick them somewhere by themselves. I was at the medical school in Meharry when they got these computers in there, and they set up these little cubicles, and then you could go in and check out something, go in there and work on the computer. And I told the guy, William Greer, used to be Price Cobb, Bill Greer did the book Black Ray. So Bill Greer, I said, Bill, this ain't gonna work. He said, why? I said, because we like to watch TV together, and there's no room for company. You know, that's nice. That's nice for little European kids who don't mind working by themselves. Africans like to work together. And sure enough, we went in there, you had 4 or 5 people all trying to get in the same boat. We're social people. Social learning is human learning. That's what Piaget even said. He was a big individual psychologist, but he said social learning, it matters. Sometimes you learn more from the other than you do from yourself. I mean, from your teacher. So this collective business in terms of technique, connected to peers, connecting the learning process to the family, connecting the learning process to the community, and connecting the learning process to the environment. This is African teaching. Immersion in community wisdom through proverbs, stories, ceremonies, celebrations, and especially the use of the moving school, and especially the use of the elders, and especially with community approval. Now, everything I just said, especially the last few things I said, is alien to the current public school education process. Community doesn't figure in, except as something that you check off by getting 5 hand-picked people to serve on the PTA, serve them coffee and crumpets, and keep them out of the business of the school. That's different than what Africans require an embeddedness in the community. Last 2 things, very briefly. Content. What is the content of the education process for African pedagogy? The whole life of the community is the content. The whole heritage of the community is the content. The skills necessary to perform in the community. We don't forget skills. Even standard English, writing, mathematics, physics, chemistry, those things we want and get. And it's easy for our geniuses. They don't have any problem when they're taught well. Their biggest problem is access to a quality education, access to opportunity. They don't have it. Geopolitical and economic lessons. That's what Dr. McAdoo was saying. If you have, I did a review of a study that was done for CDC on black male suicide. They had a jump in black male suicide of some 400% in the course of about 4 years. The CDC sounded the alarm, and they started doing studies and retrospective analyses. One of the things they found out, 2 things they found out. In fact, both of them were the questions I suggested. One of the things they found out was that the students who committed suicide, first they were all graduates for the most part, working. So these were not, lazy folk who had dropped out or anything. But the one thing they had is that their parents had never taught them anything about racism. So they internalized, just like Harry said, they internalized and blamed themselves for the abuse that they were receiving and blew themselves away. And the second thing is they didn't belong to anything. So in either case, they had no way to check the reality they were experiencing against anything.
That's right.
It's very simple. So that we have to be concerned about the geopolitical realities and whether our children understand them. The content is the environment, the ecology, and ma'at. That's our business. How people are, whether they are really taking care of the world. This world doesn't belong to people who think they own it.
No.
It belongs to everybody on it. You can't pollute the ocean just because you got the money to pollute it and I got to swim in it. So we've got an obligation to say something about the common space that people have privatized. There's no privatization of common space. And identity is the content. This is the thing that people didn't want us to do, to know that we belong together. They want our kids to have any sense of belonging. Content is the orientation that we should have, the values that we should have, the attitudes that we should have, and then the social bonds that we should create. And finally, what kind of outcomes do we expect if we do all of this? What are the goals? By the way, I mean, if you look at people who currently are responsible for education, this is not the schema that they're working with. And so when people check on whether schools are good or bad, they can't check for the purposes that we want. They want to know whether they got a good score on the Iowa, the California, and stuff like that. The outcome that we seek is character in the children, just like in the teachers. Competency in all of those skill areas, plus competency in all the aim areas that I talked about. Children who finish school who have a greater sense of purpose. Children who finish school who have the beginnings of a mission. Children who finish school who have a calling. A lot of people have competency with no calling, no mission, no purpose. Children who have a sense of belonging. Children who feel that they must strive for perfection. Some of us are actually taught that you can't perfect yourself. Africans believe in the perfectibility of human beings. Children who are able to critique the structures of domination. Children who are able to protect and defend our history and our culture, our land and our people. These are successful outcomes. And finally, children who are able to build for eternity. Those are the outcomes as African people that have been universal with us from the beginning of time up to the present time for those Africans that are independent. Thank you.